Welcome back to Episodes of Kin. In today's episode, we're going to talk about why you care too much about what others think, and what Carl Jung understood about this that most people never learn. This audio recording includes subtitles, so you can follow along more intentionally and absorb the ideas at your own pace. Why is it that so many thoughtful, capable people spend their entire lives quietly performing for an audience that isn't even paying attention? They rehearse conversations before they happen. They replay conversations after they're over. They choose their clothes, their words, even their opinions, based on some imagined panel of judges sitting just behind their shoulder. And yet, if you ask them directly, "Do you care what people think?" they'll usually say no, not really. But their behavior tells a different story, because underneath the surface, a lot of these same people are exhausted, quietly ruled by a fear they've never fully named, the fear of being seen wrong. And it turns out there's a reason for that. Most people build their sense of safety around other people's approval, and when that happens, the very thing that once protected them as children becomes the exact thing that imprisons them as adults. So let's talk about why this happens, and more importantly, how to undo it. Because none of this is about vanity or weakness. It's about a survival strategy that stopped working, and if you understand how you got here, you can start to find a way out. When we're young, we are, in a very real sense, dependent on the approval of others for survival. A child who displeases the people around them risks losing food, warmth, attention, love itself. So the nervous system learns, early and permanently, that being watched favorably is not a preference, it's safety. Long before you can reason your way through it, your body has already decided that other people's opinions of you are a matter of survival, and it treats every judgment, every raised eyebrow, every disappointed silence as a small emergency. And for a while, this works. Reading the room keeps you out of trouble. Adjusting yourself to match expectations earns praise. You become skilled at sensing what people want from you before they even ask, and that skill feels like an advantage. You avoid conflict. You avoid embarrassment. You become, in a sense, socially fluent. But here's the hidden cost. When your sense of self depends on constantly monitoring other people's reactions, you never fully learn to generate your own internal sense of okay. You were taught to check outward for confirmation before you ever learned to check inward for truth. And over time, you internalize a very dangerous idea. If people approve of me, I am fine. If they don't, something is wrong with me. And that belief will quietly sabotage everything once you grow older. Because the moment someone frowns, disagrees, or simply doesn't respond the way you hoped, it doesn't feel like a normal, forgettable moment in adult life. It feels like evidence. So instead of tolerating the discomfort of being misunderstood, you avoid situations where that could happen. You stay quiet about opinions that might be unpopular. You over-explain yourself after saying something honest. You rehearse texts for 20 minutes before sending them. And slowly your life starts to narrow. You only say what's safe. You only do what's expected. You protect the image of someone agreeable and easy to approve of, instead of ever finding out what you'd say or do without that filter running constantly in the background. And that's the trap, because while everyone else is out there saying the wrong thing, being misunderstood, and surviving it completely intact, you're locked inside a mind that treats every social interaction like a performance review. And the longer that goes on, the harder it becomes to tell the difference between your actual thoughts and the thoughts you've pre-approved for public consumption. At some point, you realize you've spent so long managing what people think of you that you're not entirely sure what you think of yourself. You can't afford to be disliked. You can't afford to be misread. You can't afford to let the mask slip, even for a moment, in case someone sees something unacceptable underneath it. So you keep monitoring. And that's when the isolation starts to set in, even while you're constantly surrounded by people whose opinions you're desperately trying to manage. Carl Jung had a concept that explains exactly why this feels so consuming. He believed that much of what we call our personality is actually a persona, a mask carefully built to be acceptable to the outside world, and that the persona itself isn't the problem. Everyone needs one to function in society. The problem begins the moment you forget it's a mask and start treating other people's reactions to it as the final verdict on your worth. Jung also believed that we project disowned parts of ourselves onto others constantly, which means the judgment you're so afraid of is rarely as objective as it feels. Often, The harshest imagined critic in your head isn't really speaking for the people around you. It's speaking for the parts of yourself you've already decided are unacceptable, and you've simply outsourced the verdict to an audience, so you don't have to deliver it to yourself directly. Because real freedom from this fear requires noticing where the judgment is actually coming from, not just managing its symptoms. Think about it. Most of the disapproval you brace for never actually arrives. People are far too consumed with managing their own imagined audience to spend as much time judging you as you assume. And if you keep organizing your entire life around a courtroom that mostly exists in your own mind, you miss the exact moments that would show you how little most people are actually paying attention. You don't take the interesting job because someone might think it's a strange choice. You don't say the honest thing in the group chat because someone might screenshot it. You don't wear what you actually like because someone might raise an eyebrow you'll never even see. And without realizing it, you start living a life curated for spectators who, in most cases, were never really watching. But you still want to feel secure, right? So what do? You lean on what you know. Vigilance. You try to prevent disapproval before it happens, instead of learning to survive it after it does. And this leads to something we could call anticipatory self-editing, where you quietly rewrite yourself in advance to avoid any possible negative reaction. It works, up to a point. You can seem consistently likable, agreeable, safe to be around. But underneath, you're depleted, because instead of engaging with people, you're constantly performing risk assessment on your own personality. So now even simple interactions become something you have to manage carefully. And to avoid getting it wrong, you start saying less, revealing less, risking less. This is where the isolation deepens. But you're perceptive, right? You should be able to figure this out. So you try to reason your way out of caring what people think. You tell yourself their opinions don't matter. You remind yourself that everyone's too busy with their own lives to judge you. None of it fully works, because the fear isn't actually located in logic. It's located in an old embodied belief that disapproval equals danger, and no amount of intellectual reassurance fully reaches a fear that lives beneath thought. There's no argument clever enough to answer the real question underneath it all. Am I allowed to exist as I actually am, without a majority vote? That question can only be answered by actually existing as yourself, in front of people, and finding out you survive it, not by convincing yourself in private that it shouldn't matter. And when that fear becomes too exhausting to manage, when the constant self-monitoring starts to feel unbearable, that's when a final defense kicks in. You tell yourself, I just have high standards for myself. I just care about doing things right. And now, instead of admitting that you're terrified of being disliked, you convince yourself that your vigilance is simply conscientiousness, not because you actually believe that's the whole story, but because it hurts less than admitting how much power you've handed to other people's opinions. This is a kind of quiet, respectable avoidance, and it's one of the most isolating patterns you can fall into, because it lets you keep performing without ever having to name what you're performing for. So how do we fix this? The first step, and this is non-negotiable, is that you have to stop treating other people's reactions as verdicts on your worth. Not because feedback doesn't matter, but because outsourcing your entire sense of okay to an audience keeps you perpetually unsettled. When your stability depends on universal approval, you will do everything in your power to avoid honesty, avoid risk, and avoid ever discovering what you actually think, feel, or want beneath the performance. So the fix is to build your sense of security from the inside instead of borrowing it from a crowd. You stop asking, what will people think of this? And you start asking, is this actually true for me? You stop pre-editing yourself out of imagined disapproval and start letting your real reactions exist before you manage them. You let yourself say the honest thing occasionally and watch the world not end. And yes, it's uncomfortable. It feels exposed, even reckless at first. It feels like removing a safety mechanism you've relied on your whole life. But it's not a step backward, because it's the first real step toward becoming someone whose stability doesn't rise and fall with a stranger's passing opinion. The old identity told you that safety came from unanimous approval. The new one reminds you that safety was always meant to come from inside you. You just handed the job to everyone else by default. Being human means you're allowed to be disliked occasionally and remain completely fine. You're allowed to say something unpopular and survive the silence that follows. You're allowed to exist without a majority vote confirming it's acceptable. But the only way forward is to practice this in small, honest moments, not in one dramatic act of rebellion, not perfect confidence, not total indifference to others, just small, repeated proof that disapproval, when it comes, is survivable, until your nervous system finally starts to believe it. So if you're someone who rehearses conversations before they happen, who feels a small jolt of dread at the thought of being misunderstood, if you've spent your whole life managing an audience that was mostly imaginary, this is where you begin. You let go of the courtroom. You stop performing for a verdict that was never really being handed down. You start existing instead, because you don't need unanimous approval to belong in your own life. You just need to be someone who's willing to be seen honestly, even when it's uncomfortable, even when someone disagrees, even when the silence after you speak feels unbearable for a second before it passes. And if you can do that, if you can stop outsourcing your worth to a jury that was mostly in your head, you'll start to feel something you haven't felt in a long time: steadiness. Not because everyone approved of you, but because you finally stopped needing them to. If any part of this resonated with you, if you recognized yourself in these patterns, leave a comment and let me know what stood out. Chances are you're not the only one who feels this way, and sometimes naming the pattern is the first real step to breaking it. Thanks for listening to Episodes of Kin. Take care of your mind, and I'll see you in the next episode.